Okay, so hi, my name is Tonia Tanner, and I'm a grad student, and Scott Mitchell is my supervisor. And so I'm going to be talking about trends and transitions between farm types and changes in the spatial layouts of farm fields. And that's part of the farm model that we built in, nestled in Vision, that Dan was talking about a little bit. So what are we interested in modeling? So we're interested in farm types, their average sizes, and their field sizes, which serve as indicators for farm management and land use intensity, and also as bioindicators for local diversity and ecosystem services. This allows us to recognize and incorporate the reality that the agricultural industry is always changing, and that farms aren't static through time, and that this has implications for issues related to land management. So we're interested in the future possible trends in the number of different types of farming operations, the size of those operations, and in field size. So if we're looking at present trends in agriculture, we know that Eastern Ontario is part of a larger national and global trend. Throughout the 20th century, most developed nations have experienced growth in their farm sizes. And what that farm size growth translates into is that we tend to have fewer farms that are larger. In Eastern Ontario, we're seeing an average loss of about 364 farms every 5 years, and an average farm size increase of about 5 to 9 hectares every 5 years. But what these figures don't really tell us are what kinds of farms we're losing and where they're going. Are they retiring? Are they being bought by other farmers? Are they abandoned? And how does the mosaic of different farm type operations change over time? So this is kind of more talking about what Dan was talking about in terms of the different farm types that we've developed. So on the left you can see the main farm types that were developed by Ted Huffman, and then you can see Dan's breakdown of those farm types into more dynamic categories. So this is a quick overview of what we've found so far from the agricultural census, looking at the data from 1991 to 2011, and these trends are based on our linear projections. And so essentially the red circles indicate a decrease in the number of these farm types. The green circles indicate an increase in the number of these farms, and then a green arrow indicates that these farms are increasing in size. So essentially the takeaway message from this figure is that field crop farms are the only farms that are increasing in number, and the only farms that have, a field crop component see any increases in average farm size. And so we use this information to guide our model so that we can represent a greater diversity of farm types that are dynamic in terms of their number and size, and also by changing the types of farms in the landscape, we're affecting the diversity and abundance of different crop types. So for example, if we're seeing an increase in field crop farms and a decrease in farms with animal or livestock components, we would expect to see a decrease in things like pasture and perennial cover. Okay, so what drives field farm size trends? So there are economic drivers. Canadian agricultural support programs tend to be unevenly accessed among farmers, and most commonly are used by large business-focused farms, which help them access the resources that can grow their farms even larger. Larger farms are also, with greater capital investments, are more easily able to acquire more farmland and to farm it. There are also some market drivers that might be impacting these trends, such as the volatility of market prices of agricultural products, specifically the prices of animal meat products, which may encourage farmers to retire or drop that component of their operation because it's just not making them enough money. We also see changes in structure, so meaning that the amount of land actually in production hasn't really changed over time, but ownership really has. And we see most farmland being sold is being bought by expanding operations, and also expansion is being facilitated by an increase in the amount of land that's being leased to grow. There have also been advances in technology, mechanical in terms of the equipment that's on the land, and biological in terms of the field crops that we have available that facilitate farm size growth as well. So we also want to talk about field sizes. So there hasn't really been a whole lot of coverage of field size trends in literature, and none that exist for field size trends in Canada. And what discussion that there is indicates that field sizes for cash crops such as corn and soy are growing. And so this is an example here of a study that was done in Iowa looking at the difference between field sizes for corn from 1989 to 2011. And so we really just see that there's a tendency towards a lot fewer of the smaller fields. And the concern with this trend is that larger fields reduce the potential for greater crop diversity, and which can affect the persistence and spread of some diseases or pests. It can also reduce the amount of non-crop habitat in the landscape by eliminating those semi-natural boundaries that exist between fields like hedgerows. And larger fields tend to be more associated with intensive agricultural practices, since that sometimes they're compensating for an ecosystem service that was reduced or lost by the loss or reduction in non-crop habitat in the landscape. Okay, so one of the part of my project for my thesis was trying to quantify field size change in Eastern Ontario. The lack of coverage in field size trends, specifically in Canada, motivated me to try to quantify this change. And so I worked off the farmland project data that was collected between 2011 and 2012 for the 93 landscapes at 3 by 3 kilometer study sites. And I visually interpreted Landsat and Google Earth time series imagery, comparing the 2011-2012 data to 2015, and then digitized those changes in field configurations. And to be honest, there were modest increases in field sizes. In this example, there was really only like this major one that happened right here. So we turned, I think it was about 10 fields into 1 field. Over half of the strategic sites saw an increase in mean field size, and in many cases they were small, less than 1 hectare per site growth in field size. But 17% of the sites saw an increase in mean field size that was greater than 13%, or an increase in field size that was greater than 2 hectares per field on those sites. So again, modest, but over a greater time period across the landscape, those changes have implications for issues such as biodiversity and ecosystem services that they provide. So here's an example of what some of this consolidation looks like on the ground. So for instance, in 2011, we have this one set of fields. There's 10 of them. Their average size is 1.8 hectares. By 2015, the barriers, which were most likely hedgerows, were taken down between these fields, increasing the average field size to 19.5 hectares. And then on the right here, this is actually what this looks like when you're looking. Oh, one sec. There we go. Got it. Sorry, this picture is actually what it looks like whenever those edges are taken down. So this is before they've actually removed the edge material, so that they could use the field as one big field. So what is driving field size trends? So land management practices are shifting. Smaller fields made more sense in the past, but many of the benefits that they offered in combination with non-crop boundaries have been made obsolete by more intensive practices. So we just don't need them anymore, because we can use things like fertilizer or pesticides. And as well, because of these non-crop boundaries are most effective when they're implemented systematically through a landscape, the more boundaries that are removed, the less effective their coverage actually becomes. So once you start taking down a couple, even if it's your neighbors taking down some of these boundaries, yours may be less effective, and you might decide to take them down then. As well, there's a conversion of non-crop lands, or the repurposing of unproductive lands. Sometimes these semi-natural habitats are seen as unproductive or even burdensome because they have to be managed and maintained. And also there's been the increase in efficiency of farm machinery means that fields or crops that have a longer length have a reduced associated harvest time. So the bigger the crop, the faster they can get things into it and off of it. So that's preferable for farmers. So now we're going to get into the farm model, which covers expansion, transition, and retirement. So how can we take trends in farm number, size, type, and try to model them? So I'm mostly going to focus on the expansion event because that's the more complicated process that we went through, and then talk a little bit about transition and retirement. So essentially, for the expansion events, we've created a list of farms that we've called the expanding farm types. So thinking back to that image with the farm type trees, an expanding farm type is a farm that's growing in average farm size. So this could mean that those farms are decreasing in number, so we have fewer but larger farms, or they could be increasing in number and size, so we have more of them and they are larger. And one of these expanding farm types is the field crop grain farm type. So they don't have any livestock, they only have cash crops. And so in this map, we see all of the field crop grain farms in the Storm and Dundas region, Glengarry region. And what we do in a given year is that we select a farm from this region because we're using census data region to region. And we select a farm in this region for expansion. And so there's the example of the farm here that we ended up selecting. It's in this area for expansion. So this is what it looks like when you're looking at the map. This is a map extracted from Envision, but this is what it would look like if you were looking at it in Envision. So it's made up of this parcel here, and all the rest has just been blanked out so you don't get overloaded with land use types. So it's an average. It's starting out in 2015, and it's an average farm size that we've placed on the land. So then what we do is we conduct a 15-kilometer search from the boundary of the selected farm. So here's our farm here, and here's our search buffer. And so we have a system of farms that this field crop farm would like to buy. And so in this case, a field crop grain farmer would prefer to buy a farm like dairy only or dairy and hay, dairy and field crop. And it considers these farms equally. And what went into the consideration of what kind of farm this particular farm would like to buy was looking at the kinds of farms and farming operations that are exiting the market or retiring, so we can absorb those farms, and also a consideration of how compatible the land was with the farm that's being bought is to the operation that's buying it, because we don't want a field crop farmer buying a farm that it can't plant its crops on. So there is a consideration of soil land class. Sorry about that. So there also are secondary choices if for some reason it doesn't find a farm that's nearby to expand to. But it did. It found a field crop farm in 2015 that was just to the northeast. And they expanded their land holdings then for this particular farm from 626 hectares to 538, so it gained about 100 hectares. And then after that expansion event occurs, these new fields that it acquires over here, if it's not the same farm type, get placed into the buying farm types rotation scheme. In this case, nothing had to happen because it was already a field crop farm. And so when do the expansions stop? So we continue those expansion events within a given year until we've reached or come close to the projected average farm size for that region that we've created using the agricultural census data. So we would stop when we get somewhere in here. Okay, so and also expansions can occur more than once for a single farm, but they can't occur. They can only occur 5 years after an original expansion has happened. So in 2020, this farm expands again. It buys another field crop grain operation in the north, bringing its size to 621 hectares. So then it expanded again in this run of the model in year 2028, and now reaching a size of 205 hectares. Okay, so essentially there are three mechanisms that we use in the model to influence change in the number of farm types over time. The first is through expansion, which we just discussed, and the other two mechanisms are farm transition and farm retirement. And I'm just going to really briefly touch on these because the farm transition part of the model isn't entirely working, or we're not seeing outputs from it. So essentially farm transition occurs when we're trying to reduce the number of a certain farm type and increase the number of another one. So oftentimes that means that a farm is changing their primary operation. So for instance, a cow, calf, and field crop might become a field crop and cow, calf farm. And retirement happens when farms are, we're trying to reduce that number, but we haven't been able to do that through transition or farm expansion. And so we retire farms so they're no longer considered to be active or no longer part of the model anymore. And so both of these events are triggered when an expected reduction in the number of a certain farm type hasn't been reached through these other mechanisms, mainly the expanding farm model. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about the altering of the configuration of fields through consolidation. So in this portion of the model, we were interested in changing the configuration of fields by joining them. So what this means is that fields are expected to increase in size over time, and we're attempting to model this change by joining or merging fields. And when an expansion event occurs, or when a farm is considered for expansion, because some farms don't actually find a neighbor that they can buy, field consolidation is triggered on those farms. It also happens when farms are changing type. So the rules are fairly simple. In a given year, fields that are adjacent, so there's no distance between them, are planted in the same crop type, will be consolidated, and this can happen for multiple fields that happen to be all within the same distance of each other. And they're consolidated in the sense that they're treated by the model as one field. So we're not actually physically joining these fields. You'll still see the division in the outputs, but they're being treated by the model as the same. So they're put in the same rotation. And the only time when amalgamations won't happen between fields are when they're separated by features, such as roads or drainage ditches. And so here we're back at our 2015 example of a field crop grain farm. And so any of the fields that you see in the same color that are adjacent to one another, assuming that there's no barriers, would become joined. And so, for instance, it would be like, these fields here. Some of these guys would all become one. And then they would just be treated as one throughout the model in the coming years. And so this allows us to change field size through time as it's triggered by these events that we've talked about. So future work. So we're still working out some of the technical difficulties involved in this model, but when those have been resolved, we want to look at things like the distribution of field sizes by crop type, the abundance and diversity of crop types, so changes in cover of certain crop types. And both of these outputs are really important because they're indicators for things like land use intensity and diversity. And what's most interesting about them is that these are the most stochastic elements of this model. So we can control the numbers that help drive the figures that we have in the output, but we don't know from the beginning of a run how many fields are actually going to be amalgamated or the diversity of some crops. So future iterations might consider things like farmer typology. So considering the social demography of farmers as an important understanding of farmer behavior, rather than just broadly categorizing all farmers as being the same based on their sector or their primary activity. We also might consider the effect that distance from farm headquarters affects plant cropping decisions. And also, we really focused in this round on the business as usual scenario because it was a lot of work just to get there, but in the future we might try expanding our understanding of how farm types and their distribution might change over time in different scenarios would be good. So that's my presentation.
Thanks. Any questions about Tonia's work?
I had a quick question.
Yep.
The one slide there, I think it was the second or third last one, where you had the different cadastral
Which one?
farms and how they grow. Do you have any is there any rules of what you have within the CAD that can determine if those fields get amalgamated to that farm? Like when we did the initial modeling of the farms, we had certain farm types couldn't have different combinations of different crops or whatever. You know,
It's like a ranked list, right? It's which ones they would prefer to have.
Yeah.
If you can't get those. Then
Yeah, exactly. Is there a rule set or anything?
It follows the same rotational schemes,
Yeah.
Same?
so it's
Yeah.
you would get the same land covers.
Okay. So it'll just buy them up and then it'll convert them to something?
Yeah.
Converts them to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question, comment regarding pollinators. Has that been studied at all? The going into large fields and looking at pollinator density? The reason I mention it is I was recently out west in northern Alberta where field size is possibly 10 times what it is here. Mm-hmm. And so they started looking at this and they went to the middle of the field. We're talking, huge fields, and they were noticing no pollinators, and this was having an impact on yields because they can only go so far, the bees. And so I'm curious, as a suggestion, maybe it would be good to establish baseline pollinator densities now in eastern Ontario, and as these farms get bigger, that might be an issue in the future?
Yeah, no, that is something that I've come across in literature, and we did work for a little while with people at National Wildlife and Research Center who were working on a project that was taking field sizes and then trying to see what the pollinator presence would be in an area based on field sizes. It's not something we incorporated into the model, but it's definitely something that would be useful because if there is such a relationship, like that really big fields are just not being penetrated by pollinators. Yeah. So it's something that I'm writing about. It's not something that we've incorporated as of yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Tonia. I wondered if in the retirement part of the model, if it took into effect any economic drivers to retire land like Alice or future offsets that might be created?
No, that's a future. That's future work. Yeah, no, that's something that we've thought about and we've discussed a little bit, but it's not something that got worked into this particular iteration.
And so for the retirement, the factors that went into it were purely like productive capacity, or?
It was purely based on the trends that we were seeing in farm types over time. So the farm types that we would expect to disappear.
Right.
So they were mostly just farms that had a livestock component, like purely cattle farms or dairy farms in some cases. There wasn't any consideration of economics that went into this round.
Okay, thank you.
There would have been some consideration of land capability. So
Sure.
if it's
Yeah.
land that wouldn't support field crops, for example, it could be retired.
Yeah. So how transferable it is, essentially. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Hey, Tonia, here's. Can you hear me?
It's just there's a little bit of feedback.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm getting noise. I thought it was your end.
No, it's yours, Ruth. I think it's using your computer mic, not your boom mic.
No, I don't think it's me. I think it maybe somebody else may not be on mute. Because I was
Oh,
hearing
there was a bit of that
when
earlier.
when I was on mute, I was hearing that same sound. So it's not me. I'm not sure where it's coming from. So just to follow up on PRE, but I have a question, biodiversity question for you. I think what put the hives, place them in the middle of the field. So I'm not sure that isn't something that could be managed just operationally. So I don't know if that's a good thing to pursue, but I'm just wondering about your looking at biodiversity and the wildlife habitat in terms of these changes on the landscape, and I wondered if you had a chance to do some of that and what you might have found.
Well, so we're still unfortunately waiting for some of our results to make a little more sense with what we'd expect. So right now I'm mostly just talking about associations that have to do with things like with providing like refuge for some species, or especially in the case of species that help manage pests in crops. But we don't have any terribly useful results at the moment.
I'm guessing that probably the just the even forest cover and the non-managed landscape has changed a lot. Like the distance between these kind of habitat patches has become greater.
Sure. Yeah. That's definitely true. Yeah.
But,
And the reduction in forest in general was something that I found when I was looking just at field sizes in Eastern Ontario. So that's part of it too. Yeah.
So for the purpose of Tonia's thesis, we're really drawing on other people's results that have looked at all these questions and say, okay, here are the dynamics that feed into that without trying to make a specific biodiversity projection.
Yeah, and this is what it means. So you're discussing what it means in the context of
Exactly, of the changes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I had a question just about the modeled expansion. It's Pam here in Guelph. It looked like in 2028 that field, it's actually orange in this picture with the perennial, but as the expansion went out, actually in that one there, it's that same field has the large perennial cropland. I was wondering if the model it had to go further. I'm wondering, it was a field crop expansion, and it was field crops in earlier years, then went to perennial. So it's that, it's not the circled field, it's the one more down.
This one?
Oh, I'm pointing at it here, but that one there, yes. And in prior years, it was field crops, and is the model kind of compensating for if that went in some of the perennial, they had to go further to get field crop land? Or just why that switched to perennial, I guess, in that year when it was field crop expansion that was happening?
It's based on the rotation scheme. So perennial cover is part of the field crop rotation scheme. So it just happened to be perennial in that year.
Oh, so you have perennials in your field crop. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll follow up with that later. Thanks.
Any more questions? None? Okay.
All right.
Thank
so
you.
we are running 35 minutes behind.